It was a quiet afternoon at the corner store, the kind where the only sounds are the hum of a cooling fridge and the soft chatter of customers browsing. The store, tucked away in a modest neighborhood, was a safe haven for the locals, a place to grab a cold drink or a quick snack on the way home. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint scent of tobacco lingering from the last customer. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the doors swung open with a sharp chime, signaling the arrival of someone who would soon shatter the calm. A young boy, no older than 15, walked into the store, his eyes scanning the shelves for his favorite soda. His name was Marcus, a regular customer, well known and liked by the shopkeeper. As he reached for a bottle of lemonade, he noticed a police car idling outside. The officer behind the wheel, Officer Cooper, had parked in a way that blocked the entrance, making the air around the store feel tense, though no one could place why. As Marcus stood by the fridge, popping the cap off his drink, he was startled by a voice behind him. "Hey, kid, where'd you get that chain?" The voice was sharp, demanding. Marcus turned around, his hand instinctively clutching the gold chain around his neck. It was a gift from his late grandmother, something he held close. He didn't expect the officer to speak to him, let alone question him. His heart raced, a feeling of unease settling deep in his stomach. "I got it from my grandmother," Marcus replied, his voice steady, but his mind racing. He wasn't sure why the officer was so fixated on him. "Yeah, right," Officer Cooper said, stepping closer. "That's a pretty expensive piece of jewelry for a kid like you. It looks like something you'd steal." Marcus's face flushed. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, the officer stepped forward, grabbing him by the arm. "Give me the chain. It's mine now," Officer Cooper barked. Marcus yanked his arm back, anger bubbling inside him. "I told you, it's mine." He stepped back, his hand tightening around the chain. This wasn't the first time he had been racially profiled, but the sudden escalation of the situation felt different. He knew he was in trouble, and his heart hammered in his chest. At that moment, a familiar voice echoed through the store, loud, commanding, and full of authority. "Cooper, let go of him." Marcus looked up to see his father, Elijah Freeman, standing in the doorway. His presence filled the room, his sharp eyes locking onto the officers. Elijah Freeman, an FBI agent, had seen his fair share of corruption in the force, but this was different. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. Elijah didn't need to say another word. His gaze was enough to demand respect. Officer Cooper, still holding onto Marcus's arm, hesitated. The boy, looking from his father to the officer, felt a mixture of fear and relief wash over him. He knew his father would handle this, but he also knew the situation was more complicated than it seemed. "Let him go, Cooper," Elijah said again, his voice low but firm. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a second, the officer's resolve wavered. Elijah Freeman stood in the doorway, a commanding figure whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the room. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with the authority earned through years of experience in the FBI. At 42, his face was chiseled, with sharp lines that told the stories of decades spent in high-stakes situations. His eyes, a piercing shade of brown, could see through the facades people tried to put up, reading them as easily as a book. Elijah had come a long way from the streets of his youth, born and raised in a neighborhood not unlike the one he now found himself standing in. He had seen the challenges of growing up in a tough environment firsthand, the struggles, the broken systems, and the inequalities that often define the daily lives of people like him. Black, working class, and fighting against the odds had shaped his worldview, but instead of succumbing to the cycle of hardship, he chose to break free, channeling his anger and frustration into something constructive: justice. His path to becoming an FBI agent had not been easy. The process was grueling, and the challenges were even more pronounced because of his background. Many had questioned his motivations. Some had even doubted whether someone like him could truly belong in the elite ranks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The years of hard work, the sleepless nights, and the sacrifices had all paid off. Though, he had made it, and now he stood as a symbol of hope for others who came from similar circumstances. But despite his success, Elijah had not forgotten where he came from. He still saw the same systemic racism and corruption that plagued his community in the very institution he now worked for. The police department, a force meant to protect and serve, often acted as an oppressive presence in the lives of people of color. He had encountered instances of racial profiling and police misconduct countless times, and it always made him sick to his core. He could not stand idly by while injustice was allowed to fester. It was this commitment to justice that brought him to this moment. Elijah had been on a routine visit to the neighborhood, checking in with some of the local leaders and keeping an eye on things, when he received a call from his son Marcus. His heart sank. He had been trying to shield Marcus from the harsh realities of the world for as long as he could, but deep down, Elijah knew that sooner or later, the world would come for him. He had always told Marcus that his success would come with its own set of challenges that no one, not even his father, could fully protect him from. As Elijah entered the store, his sharp gaze immediately locked onto Officer Cooper, who was still holding onto Marcus's arm. The officer's demeanor was one of entitlement, a belief that he could act with impunity, that the power he wielded was unquestionable. Elijah could feel the tension radiating through the room. The boy who was his son was caught in the grip of an officer who had made an assumption based solely on Marcus's appearance, an assumption that Elijah knew was rooted in the biases that ran deep within law enforcement. For a moment, Elijah did not speak. He simply stood there, taking in the scene, measuring the situation with a calm that was both terrifying and reassuring. His silence was deafening, and the officer seemed to hesitate, sensing that this was not a confrontation he could easily win. Elijah had faced danger countless times in his career, but this was different. This wasn't an enemy he could take down with a quick maneuver or a well-placed shot. This was a battle of wills, one that would play out not with physical strength, but with the power of his authority and his unwavering commitment to protecting his son. "Let him go, Cooper," Elijah said finally, his voice low but unwavering. The words were not a suggestion, nor a plea, they were a command. A command born of the years he had spent watching men like Officer Cooper abuse their power and authority, all the while knowing that he would not let this kind of injustice slide. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate, how easy it would be for Marcus to become yet another statistic, another story of a young black man wrongfully detained, harassed, or worse. Elijah had seen it all before, too many times, and he would not allow it to happen to his son. The officer looked up at him, momentarily taken aback by the strength in Elijah's voice. But his hesitation was fleeting, as he knew who Elijah Freeman was. He had seen him around the precinct before, heard stories of his reputation. It wasn't every day that an FBI agent walked into a situation like this. Cooper had no intention of backing down. Not just yet. But something in Elijah's gaze made him pause. For a brief moment, everything in the room hung in the balance. Marcus, still gripping the chain around his neck, looked from his father to Officer Cooper, his heart racing in his chest. He had always known his father as a protector, as a man who stood up for what was right. But now, in this moment, Marcus realized just how much of that protection had come at a cost. Elijah had put himself in danger countless times to shield people from the very system that was now trying to break his family apart. But for all his power and authority, Elijah knew this battle would be long. It wouldn't end with just one confrontation. There would be more moments like this, more times when he would have to step into the breach and defend his family and his community. He was prepared for that fight. He had been preparing for it his entire life, and he would not stop fighting. Not for his son, not for anyone who faced injustice in the system. "Let him go, Cooper," Elijah repeated, his voice now tinged with an unspoken warning. This was not the time for games. This was a moment of reckoning. Elijah Freeman's pulse quickened as the confrontation in the store began to settle, but his mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about his son, Marcus. It was about something deeper, something systemic that stretched far beyond the walls of that small, dimly lit corner store. As Officer Cooper reluctantly released Marcus, A silent agreement seemed to pass between them. This was not the end of the matter, but only the beginning. Elijah knew the real battle would be fought outside, in the trenches of bureaucracy and power. The police department was not a place that often welcomed scrutiny, and yet Elijah had spent his entire career challenging it from the inside out. With Marcus now safely by his side, Elijah guided him out of the store, his eyes still locked onto Cooper, who stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had never met an FBI agent who exuded such quiet authority, especially one whose own son had become entangled in a situation like this. Cooper knew the agency's reputation for thoroughness, for leaving no stone unturned, and the thought of being caught in the middle of a scandal involving a federal agent made him uncomfortable. But Elijah was not just any agent. He was the kind of man who demanded results, who would not be deterred by the complexities of institutional power. Elijah's mind raced as he walked Marcus to his car. His first instinct was to get the hell out of that neighborhood, away from the officer who had now seen too much. But it wasn't that simple. There were more layers to this situation. Layers that Elijah could already feel pressing on his chest, urging him to uncover the truth. As a seasoned FBI agent, Elijah was trained to spot patterns, to look for connections others might overlook. And what had just happened with Marcus, while unsettling, felt like the tip of an iceberg that had yet to reveal its full mass. "Dad, what's going to happen to me?" Marcus asked as they settled into the car. His voice wavered with a mix of confusion, fear, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite articulate yet. But Elijah knew it was the feeling of powerlessness. It was the same feeling Elijah had carried with him for much of his life. The feeling of being trapped in a system designed to keep certain people down, to keep them questioning their own worth. "Don't worry about that now," Elijah said softly, his eyes trained on the road ahead. "We're going to figure this out." But Elijah wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Marcus or to himself. The ride home was filled with silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. As they pulled into the driveway, Elijah's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was an encrypted message from his colleague, Detective Sarah Moore, a longtime friend who had worked with him on several high-profile cases. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he opened the message. Sarah had always been reliable, but when she sent messages like this, it meant trouble. "Call me when you get a chance. We've got a lead on something related to the Cooper situation. It's big," the message read. Elijah didn't hesitate. He hit dial and waited as the phone rang. When Sarah picked up, her voice was urgent. "Elijah, I've been digging into Cooper's background. Something doesn't add up. He's been involved in multiple cases of excessive force, and we found a pattern. It looks like he's been working with a rogue group within the department. But that's not the worst of it. There's someone high up in the chain of command who's been covering for him. We need to move fast." Elijah's stomach tightened as he processed the information. He had suspected something like this, but to hear it confirmed was another matter entirely. Cooper wasn't just a rogue cop operating on his own. He was part of a much larger, more dangerous system. And the people protecting him weren't just local officers. They were embedded in the very structure of the department Elijah had devoted his life to. "Who's covering for him?" Elijah asked, his voice steely. Sarah hesitated for a moment. "That's where it gets tricky. We don't have all the details yet. But there's a name that keeps coming up: Captain Thomas Blake. He's been a shadow player for years, keeping his hands clean while letting others do the dirty work. Blake's reputation is untouchable, and he's been involved in multiple high-level cover-ups. If we're going to take Cooper down, we'll have to go through Blake first. But that's going to be a hell of a fight." Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the full picture was still unclear. He had a feeling this wasn't just about police brutality or a bad cop. This was something far more insidious, a web of corruption, betrayal, and power that ran deep within the very institution he had sworn to serve. "We need to meet," Elijah said, his voice firm. "This goes beyond Cooper. I need everything you've got, and I'm going to need backup. If Blake is involved, this is bigger than just a rogue officer. We're talking about a whole network of people who think they're untouchable. I'll get everything I can." Sarah replied. "I'm on it." Elijah ended the call and sat back, staring at his phone for a long moment. This was no longer just about a father protecting his son. It was about exposing a system that had been broken for far too long. A system that Elijah had once believed in but now saw for what it truly was, a machine built to protect its own, no matter the cost. His mind raced as he began to plan his next move. Elijah knew that going after Blake would be dangerous. He had the power and the influence to protect himself, and anyone who stood in his way could easily become a casualty in the fight. But Elijah had never backed down from a challenge. He had spent his career fighting for justice, and this fight would be no different. As he turned the key in the ignition and drove back into the heart of the city, his thoughts focused on the investigation ahead. There would be no shortcuts, no easy solutions. It would take time, effort, and strategy to uncover the full extent of what was happening within the department. But Elijah was ready. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. The investigation had only just begun, and with each piece of the puzzle he uncovered, the truth became more and more impossible to ignore. The consequences of Elijah's investigation quickly began to reverberate through both his professional and personal lives. What initially seemed like a routine inquiry into an officer's misconduct had snowballed into a massive web of corruption, deception, and systemic failure that would eventually consume everything in its path. Elijah had always known that the truth was a dangerous thing to pursue. But the deeper he dug, the clearer it became. This was no longer just about exposing one officer's wrongdoings. It was about dismantling an entire system that had long turned a blind eye to its flaws. And in doing so, Elijah would be forced to confront the very institution he had dedicated his life to. As the investigation gathered momentum, Elijah found himself increasingly isolated from his colleagues and even from his family. The stakes were high, and the pressure was mounting with each passing day. With every piece of evidence he uncovered, the realization set in. He was up against forces much larger and more dangerous than he had anticipated. The corrupt officers in the department were merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them lay a network of political alliances, dirty money, and backroom deals that spanned decades. And at the heart of it all was Captain Thomas Blake, a man with the power and connections to bury anyone who got in his way. But as Elijah plunged deeper into the investigation, the toll it was taking on his family became painfully apparent. His wife, Jessica, had always supported his work, but the strain of his growing obsession with the case began to create a rift between them. At first, she tried to be understanding, giving him space to do his job. But the late nights, the phone calls that came at all hours, and the constant tension in the house began to wear on her. She had never seen Elijah so consumed by a case before, and it frightened her. She feared that in his pursuit of justice, he was losing sight of the things that truly mattered: their family, their future, and the love they had once shared. "Elijah, you need to slow down," Jessica said one evening as they sat across from each other at the dinner table. "I know this case is important to you, but it's taking over everything. We barely talk anymore. You're not even here when you're here." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes heavy with the weight of the investigation. He could see the worry etched in her face, the way her voice trembled with concern. But despite the love he felt for her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something he had to finish, something that had become bigger than both of them. The truth about what was happening within the department had to be exposed, no matter the cost, and if that meant pushing his family aside, so be it. "I can't just stop, Jessica," he said, his voice tight. "There's too much at stake. People's lives are on the line. I can't walk away from this now." "I get that," she replied, her voice softening. "But you can't save the world if you lose yourself in the process. I need you here. Elijah, Marcus needs you." The mention of Marcus hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. Their son had been through enough already, and the tension in their home was only adding to his stress. Marcus had always been a bright, promising young man, but lately, Elijah could see the changes in him. His son had become withdrawn, distant, and angry. The constant upheaval in their lives, combined with the scrutiny he was under from his peers, had taken a toll on him. One evening, as Elijah sat in his study, poring over the files related to the investigation. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, a look of frustration on his face. "Are you even going to talk to me anymore?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp. "Or are you too busy chasing ghosts with this damn investigation?" Elijah set the file down slowly, feeling the weight of his son's words settle in the pit of his stomach. He had always been a dedicated father, but the demands of his work had made it difficult to balance his family life. Now, he could feel the distance between him and Marcus growing by the day. "I'm sorry, son," Elijah said quietly. "I know I haven't been around as much, but I'm doing this for you, for all of us. This case, it's bigger than anything I've ever worked on. I'm trying to make the world a safer place." "A safer place?" Marcus scoffed. "By getting mixed up with all this police corruption? You don't even know who you're dealing with anymore. It's not just about right and wrong anymore, Dad. It's about power, and you're just another pawn in their game." The bitterness in Marcus's voice stung, and Elijah was taken aback. His son had always been idealistic, believing in the inherent goodness of the world. But now, that innocence seemed to be fading, replaced by a disillusionment that Elijah couldn't fully understand. "I'm not a pawn, Marcus," Elijah said, his voice firm. "I'm trying to take down the people who've been manipulating the system for years. I'm trying to fix what's broken." But Marcus wasn't convinced. "You're breaking us, Dad. You've already broken Mom, and now you're pushing me away too." The words hit Elijah harder than he expected. He had been so focused on the case, on exposing the truth, that he hadn't seen the damage it was causing to his own family. The investigation had consumed him, but in the process, it had also created a chasm between him and the people he loved most. Elijah didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to reconcile the man he had become with the father and husband he wanted to be. As the days passed, the tension in their household only grew. Jessica's concerns became more vocal, Marcus's anger more palpable. Elijah found himself caught between two worlds: the relentless pursuit of justice in the investigation and the unraveling of his family life at home. He was running out of time to make things right before it was too late. But Elijah couldn't walk away from the investigation. The truth was too important, and he was too close to uncovering the full extent of the corruption within the police force. As the pressure mounted, Elijah found himself questioning everything he had once believed in: his job, his family, and the sacrifices he was willing to make to expose the truth. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to take a heavy toll on those he loved most. Elijah had always believed that his work would make the world a better place. But now, he was forced to confront the harsh reality that his pursuit of justice might come at the cost of everything he held dear. The culmination of Elijah's investigation was as tragic as it was eye-opening. After months of unraveling a series of corrupt practices, he had finally exposed the entire network of criminal activity within the department. The details were damning: bribery, intimidation, the silencing of whistleblowers, and even ties to organized crime. Captain Thomas Blake, the man at the center of it all, had been orchestrating these illegal dealings for years, using his position to manipulate both the law and his colleagues for personal gain. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering, and Elijah knew that the repercussions would be felt for a long time to come. Yet, despite his professional triumph, Elijah couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of personal failure. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had uncovered the truth. But in doing so, he had alienated the people he cared about most. Jessica had already made it clear that their marriage was hanging by a thread. Her patience had worn thin, and the distance between them seemed insurmountable. Marcus, too, had become a stranger in his own home. Elijah had lost sight of what truly mattered in his quest for justice. His obsessive drive to fix the world had cost him the very relationships that grounded him. The case had taken a toll on Elijah in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he stood in the courthouse watching the conviction of Blake and the others involved, the satisfaction of seeing justice served felt hollow. The emotional cost was too high. Elijah had sacrificed his peace of mind, his family, and his sense of self in pursuit of a noble cause. But the realization settled in that even the most righteous of quests could come at a tremendous personal price. No matter how much justice he had brought to the department, it had come at the expense of the life he had once known. It was during this time of reflection that Elijah began to understand the true nature of sacrifice. His pursuit of justice had been driven by an idealistic belief that exposing the truth would solve everything. He had hoped that the revelations would be enough to right the wrongs within the department, to rebuild trust, and to restore order. However, he soon came to realize that while justice in the courtroom could be achieved, justice in the heart of his family was a different matter altogether. In many ways, Elijah had been blinded by his own sense of righteousness. He had viewed his investigation as the sole means to correct the wrongs of the system, and in doing so, he had failed to see the cracks in his own home life that had been widening with each passing day. His work had consumed him, and by focusing all his energy on rooting out corruption, he had neglected the relationships that gave his life meaning. The truth was, Elijah couldn't heal the broken system without also tending to the broken pieces of his own life. The lesson Elijah learned was a painful one. There must be balance between duty and family, between justice and empathy. In his quest for truth, he had lost sight of the importance of being present for those who mattered most. True justice wasn't just about exposing the corrupt actions of others. It was also about taking care of the ones who stood by you when the battle became too much to bear. The price of righteousness had been steep, but it had also taught him a valuable lesson about the limits of one's own capacity for sacrifice. Elijah's path to redemption was not going to be easy. He had lost so much in his pursuit of justice, but he still had a chance to rebuild. His family, though fractured, was not beyond repair. Jessica had always been his partner, the one who kept him grounded, and Marcus, though angry and disillusioned, was still his son. Elijah knew that it would take time to mend the rifts that had formed between them, but the first step was acknowledging his mistakes. He couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but he could try to make amends. He could be a better husband, a better father, and, ultimately, a better man. The investigation, while a professional victory, had revealed to Elijah the deeper truth about the nature of justice itself. True justice wasn't about grand victories or public recognition. It wasn't about bringing down corrupt institutions or exposing the wrongdoers. It was about maintaining the integrity of the bonds that held us together, the family, the friendships, the love we have for one another. In the pursuit of external justice, Elijah had lost sight of the internal justice that needed to be restored within his own home. As he returned to the humdrum of everyday life, Elijah knew that his journey had only just begun. The work in the department had come to a close. But the real work, the work that would determine his legacy, was about repairing his relationships, regaining the trust of his family, and finding peace within himself. There were no shortcuts to this type of redemption. It would take time, patience, and a willingness to be vulnerable. In the end, the story of Elijah's investigation was one of growth and realization. He learned that even the most righteous of causes could lead to unforeseen consequences. But he also learned that redemption was possible, even in the wake of immense loss. He had exposed corruption within the police force, but the true challenge was to restore the integrity of the life he had once known. As Elijah took the first steps toward healing, he understood that justice was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing the wounds we all carry, whether they are within us or among those we love. Ultimately, Elijah's story is a testament to the complexities of pursuing justice in a world full of flaws. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of truth and righteousness requires us to make difficult choices. But it also teaches us that the greatest victories are often not the ones we win in the courtroom, but the ones we win in the hearts of those who matter most to us. The lesson Elijah carried forward was clear: justice begins at home.